Hey folks, I'm brownbear. Today I'll be comparing the BlizzCon demo of Warcraft III Reforged with the original Warcraft III. This is just an informal comparison. Because I can't access the demo anymore, I have to rely on the gameplay trailers and my own personal notes from my time at BlizzCon. This video is also a follow-up to my last analysis of Warcraft III Reforged. I recommend you watch that video before you watch this one. I'd like to start by diving a little bit into the art style of the two games. I commented in my last video that the developers had stuck closely to the original vision, basing my analysis off of my own impressions of the demo and the comments the developers made at a panel discussion. Several commentators disagreed with this conclusion, voicing their opinion that Reforged had gone in a noticeably different direction from the original game. This is something I paid particular attention to as I played the human campaign from Reign of Chaos. The first thing I noticed was the differences in the way cutscenes were rendered in the original game. The easiest way to explain this is with examples from Warcraft II, not only because I actually have access to that game, but also because the developers explain their approach in great technical detail in a paper available on AMD's website. Warcraft II's engine logically supports two modes: the typical in-game mode that allows storytelling from an isometric perspective, and a story mode tailored towards dialogue and close-up shots of different characters. I'll paste in figure 3 from the technical paper to show the two side by side. This trailer from the Reforged edition is classic Warcraft II. In fact, the facial animation work is so similar that I wonder if their implementation leverages some of the same code. But the first thing I noticed when I played through the original game was the lack of these kinds of cutscenes. Isometric setups, probably configured in the map editor, are used instead to facilitate the narrative, at least up to the culling mission. When you compare the two side by side, there's a substantial tonal difference. This cutscene is much grittier, it's much darker. The isometric setup is by its nature much more lighthearted because that's just how Warcraft 3 looks. If you took this in-game setup and simply applied it to the Reforged edition, it would probably come across the exact same way. But that's not how the developers approached it, so the cutscene ends up feeling a lot more serious than it did in the original game. I'm not sure if I'd call this a change in art style per se. If you look at the full motion video introduction for the original game, it's just as gritty as Reforged. I would guess that hardware and software limitations prevented the developers from achieving this vision in-engine, which is why they used isometric setups to facilitate cutscenes. This naturally gave the original game a more lighthearted feel. When lead artist Brian Sousa states that he asked what really speaks Warcraft to us, I think what he means is that the original creative vision remains the same. It's just that they're able to apply it to more places thanks to advances in technology. Basically what I'm saying is that differences in the models and animation matter depending on where in the experience you look at them. When you play a Reforged from the intended isometric camera angle, it looks practically identical to the original game. The riflemen and knights are essentially interchangeable. The biggest difference is the footman, whose movement animation looks a bit more realistic. But to be totally honest with you, I don't think I would ever notice this unless I was specifically looking for it, in comparing the two versions side by side. Where I think players should focus their feedback is on the places where the new models impact the player experience. To me, the clearest example of this is the narrative design we just mentioned. When I play the original Reign of Chaos, I never lose my sense of high fantasy. Even when Arthas is purging this village, there's always an underlying sense of goofiness. I mean, just look at this guy running across the map. You can't help but laugh a little bit as he stumbles along to Stratham. It's a completely different tone from what you see in Reforged. You can go further with this and extrapolate what'll happen with the other characters. Contrast the Prophet from the original's full motion video with the original's isometric setup. There's a similar asymmetry in seriousness and tone. The latter is a serious story that's still grounded in high fantasy, whereas the former feels much darker. The biggest risk of changing isometric setups into cutscenes is the way it strips away the player's imagination from the story. There's a lot of missing pieces when you tell a story isometrically, so players naturally have to fill in the details using their own imagination. Not only does this make the world feel vibrant and real, it also gives the player a stronger investment in the narrative because they help to write it. Your sense of Arthas and Uther, the relationship between Jaina and Arthas, and the overall implications of what Arthas decides to do are all open to interpretation. Pushing one particular interpretation isn't a good idea, because you're replacing the part of the story that players wrote themselves with your own viewpoint. There's a couple suggestions I'd like to make to try to fix this. One is that the developers have gone to great lengths to make the SD and HD versions of Warcraft 3 compatible. I wonder if that means that it's relatively easy to give players the option to use all of the original isometric setups. This will go a long way to placating veterans of the game. Just make it an option in the menus, and leave the new cutscenes on by default. The other suggestion I'd make is to restore the original portraits in the console. I mentioned last time that the new HUD doesn't look well optimized, and after spending a lot of time with the original game, that opinion has only grown stronger. Arthas' 3D model really sticks out. The old portrait would not only maintain the vibe of the original game, it also just looks better. With the art style out of the way, I'd like to talk a little bit about the gameplay. The most striking difference between the BlizzCon demo and the original game is the level of complexity. The original Culling mission features a somewhat complex map in which villagers' houses are spread across a ring that can be traversed in either direction. The BlizzCon demo streamlined this into a flat plane, clustering houses in different locations, but otherwise placing no real limits on player movement. It also eliminated the zoo, Fountain of Healing, and Goblin immersion on the left and right hand sides. I'm not exactly sure what to make of this. The BlizzCon demo targeted the entire Blizzard audience. This means that retaining the difficulty and complexity of the original mission might have made it inaccessible. But on the flip side, the whole point of a demo is to demonstrate how a game is developing. It seems to me like these changes are part of a genuine change in design direction when it comes to the single-player campaigns. Here's a quote from a BlizzCon interview with Robert Breidenbecker. I think a great example of where it's been okay is like in the demo build for folks at BlizzCon today. The Culling of Stratham, that's not the Stratham that you recognize, right? There was a zoo, and you actually started the mission in the upper right-hand corner and entered from the back. Folks on the team said, no, we need to make it like you're going in to raise the city. You want to take the town, start from the front of it, have people walk up and over the bridge to make it feel like Stratham. We had to get rid of some things. There's no zoo, but the mission itself still feels like Stratham. There's nothing significantly divorced from the original experience. This confirms the idea presented in the panel discussion that the developers are going much further with this remaster than they did with the original StarCraft. To reiterate, this is a complete rebuild of the entire mission. Not only does the cutscene feel tonally different, the complexities of the map have been removed in favor of a more streamlined experience. Now you could easily make the argument that these are good changes, given that map features like the zoo are completely superfluous, but they're still substantial changes. The demo is straightforwardly simpler and easier to think about than the original mission. Again, I'll reiterate that this is still just a demo. The Reforged team actively noted that they expected many players from World of Warcraft with little to no RTS experience. They were incentivized to make it simple and straightforward, but I'd still like to point out two things. One, the original Reign of Chaos campaign feels harder and more complex than the brutal difficulty of any of StarCraft II's campaigns. Optional quests are truly optional. Players might only find them by looking in every nook and cranny on the map. March of the Scourge, the mission preceding the Culling, features a very interesting risk-reward mechanic in which the player can move out to clear the caravan, but simultaneously risks losing static defense at home due to an incoming attack wave. The Culling itself also requires a bit of thinking to realize that the ring layout makes it very difficult to traverse the entire map, meaning Mal'Ganis can stop one group of units, but not two. This is awesome. This is what I loved about classic strategy games. They respected players, gave them a lot of credit, and presented really interesting challenges. This ought to be replicated by the remaster instead of simplified for the benefit of players from World of Warcraft. In easy or narrative mode is a much better way to address this issue. Structural changes should be made more carefully and avoid removing complexity from the experience. The other thing I wanted to mention is that just because stuff isn't relevant to the mission doesn't mean that it's useless. The Fountain of Healing is cool. Just because there's no reason to use it doesn't mean it should be taken out. When I played the original mission, I started to wonder whether fountains of healing are present in every town, or maybe that this town was built specifically because it was next to one. Aesthetic details like the zoo also play a similar role in getting players to invest a little bit into the experience. Use their imagination to create a fuller narrative. Again, this is something I love about classic games. The hardware and software limitations of that era meant that designers were never able to tell exactly the story that they wanted to. Instead, they had to leverage players' creativity to flesh out the details. You felt closer to the narrative arc because you helped to write it. This made the aesthetic touches much more meaningful because even though they were non-functional, they were still useful as storytelling devices. This is one of the reasons why I'm having so much fun with my playthrough of Reign of Chaos, even though historically I was only ever interested in the 1v1 ladder. All this reinforces for me a way of thinking about this game that may or may not prove to be true. On the multiplayer side, the developers are being very careful in their approach to the core gameplay, particularly anything that might affect competitive play. The isometric view looks incredibly similar, animations that impact gameplay are treated with caution, and feature development is focused on augmenting the existing experience instead of changing it. On this front, I'm unreservedly optimistic. But on the single player side, the developers are taking a much more relaxed approach to retaining the original narrative design. They're choosing instead to move things around as they see fit. I'm not really sure I agree with this. I think there's room for a better balance between modernization and respect for the imaginative world building that came before. I'm a little bit worried that this could turn into a George Lucas situation with the original Star Wars movies. As I mentioned earlier, I think there are a couple good solutions. An option to leverage the original isometric setups would be a simple but effective compromise with the new cutscenes. Map restructuring is a more controversial topic. All I can say for now is that I don't agree with the choices in the culling. It's possible that other changes they decide to make may strike a better balance, but it's impossible to know right now. So far, given the information we have, I don't have a strong opinion on this yet. Alrighty, thanks for watching! If you enjoyed this video, I'd love if you followed me here and on Twitter and Facebook to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.